Derrick sat at his desk, eyes locked on the screen, fingers hovering over the keys. The office was quiet, save for the hum of computers and the occasional shuffle of papers. He had worked here for 5 years, long enough to know the rhythm of things. Yet today, something felt off. From the corner of his eye, he saw the door swing open. Jason, his manager, stood there, eyes narrowing as he stepped into the room. Derrick didn't flinch. He had dealt with the subtle glances and veiled remarks over the years, but today he could sense the tension hanging in the air, thick and suffocating. "Derrick." Jason's voice was cold, almost mechanical. "I need to talk to you about your performance." Derrick's heart beat a little faster. He had heard those words before from Jason, always accompanied by a vague accusation. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, whether it was the way Jason avoided looking in the eye or the snide tone he used when speaking about him. But today, something was different. The words felt like an ultimatum. "You're not a good fit here anymore," Jason said, his eyes narrowing as he delivered the blow. "I'm letting you go." Derrick's stomach dropped. The air around him seemed to crackle with tension. He swallowed hard. He had been prepared for this moment. But then, without thinking, he stood, his voice steady and calm. "You've been trying to fire me for years, haven't you?" Jason stiffened. The air went still. Then Derrick saw it. The faintest flicker of panic in Jason's eyes. Just as quickly, Derrick smiled. "Looks like I'm not the one leaving today," he said, his voice sharp, like a blade finding its mark. Derrick's fingers hovered over the keys, his mind racing. The office was quiet, almost too quiet. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sterile glow over the rows of cubicles. Outside, the sound of traffic blended with the distant hum of the city. He had been working at this company for 5 years, but today, everything felt different. There was an edge to the air, thick with unspoken words, heavy with the weight of what was about to happen. His phone buzzed on the desk, the bright notification popping up. "Jason's in your office." "Now." Derrick sighed, his stomach sinking. He had known this moment was coming, but that didn't make it any easier. The phone call, the sudden meetings that had been piling up over the past week, the subtle shift in Jason's attitude, it all pointed to this. He had seen it before. The unspoken biases, the subtle dismissals, the invisible line that Derrick could never quite cross, no matter how hard he worked. With a deep breath, he pushed himself away from his desk and stood. The air in the office felt oppressive, the buzz of the fluorescent lights now deafening. He straightened his shirt, smoothed his tie, and walked out his cubicle, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. Each step felt heavier than the last. The door to Jason's office was already cracked open, the glass partition offering a view of Jason standing by the window. The light from the outside world caught the edges of his profile, making him appear even more distant and detached than usual. Derrick paused for a moment, his reflection in the glass flickering before him, his heart pounding in his chest. "Come in," Jason said without turning around. His voice was flat, and Derrick could feel the chill of his words from the doorway. Derrick took a deep breath and pushed the door open, stepping inside. The room felt colder than usual, and he could feel the tension hanging in the air. It wasn't just the temperature. It was the weight of the conversation that was about to unfold. Jason's back was still to him as he stared out at the city below, his silhouette rigid. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the faint hum of the air conditioning. Derrick's heartbeat was loud in his ears, his palms growing clammy. "Take a seat," Jason said, finally turning around, his eyes sweeping over Derrick before focusing on the chair across from his desk. Derrick walked over and sat, his movements deliberate, trying to mask the anxiety swirling inside him. Jason was already looking at him, his expression cold and detached, like he was prepared to deliver some final verdict. "We need to talk about your performance," Jason said, not bothering with pleasantries. His voice was controlled, but there was an undercurrent of finality to it. "It's been subpar for the past few months. The team has been reporting issues, and frankly, there have been complaints about your attitude." Derrick's stomach twisted. He'd heard this before, but never so directly. Complaints? He had worked overtime, stayed late, helped the team out when they were behind. Yet here they were once again, with him being blamed for something that wasn't his fault. I've been here 5 years, Derrick said, his voice calm but laced with frustration. I've worked hard. I've done everything you've asked of me. Jason's eyes flicked to the side, a slight tightening of his jaw. That's the problem, Derrick. You've been here 5 years, and your performance hasn't improved. You're just not fitting in. Derrick felt his chest tighten. This wasn't just about work. He could feel the weight of Jason's words, the subtle implications behind them. It wasn't just his performance that was being questioned. It was him, the way Jason looked at him, the way he avoided eye contact. Derrick knew this was about something more. Jason continued, his words cutting through the air like a blade. The decision has been made. I'm letting you go. For a moment, everything went silent. Derrick's mind raced, his thoughts a blur. He had anticipated this for months, years even. But hearing the words spoken aloud hit him harder than he expected. He tried to keep his voice steady, but he could feel the anger rising in his chest. You can't be serious, Derrick said, his voice more forceful now, a mix of disbelief and rising anger. After everything I've done for this company, you're just going to fire me like this? I've worked overtime. I've trained new hires. I've stayed late to fix problems that weren't mine to begin with. Jason leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, looking at Derrick with an almost bored expression. It's not personal, Derrick. It's just business. Your performance hasn't been up to par, and that's a fact. Derrick stood up abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. The tension in the room thickened, and for a moment, he felt the heat of his frustration flare. You've been trying to fire me for years, haven't you? He said, his voice low but sharp. Jason's eyes flickered for just a split second, a brief moment of panic that Derrick caught immediately. It was subtle, but Derrick could see it. Jason had been expecting Derrick to take the dismissal with the same resignation he always had. But not today. Derrick took a step forward, his fists clenched by his sides. His voice was steady, but his words were laced with a bitterness that came from years of being overlooked, dismissed, and discriminated against. You think I don't know what's going on here? You've been trying to find a reason to fire me for the past 2 years. But not this time, Jason. Not this time. Jason froze, his lips pressing together into a tight line. The air in the room seemed to thicken, the pressure building between them. Derrick felt the cold weight of the moment settle into his bones. He could see the fear flickering in Jason's eyes now, barely masked behind a mask of indifference. And that was when Derrick realized it. Jason wasn't in control anymore. Derrick had just taken the power back. He straightened his shoulders, the fire of defiance burning in his chest. Looks like I'm not the one leaving today. Jason didn't say a word, but the tension in the room was palpable. For the first time, Derrick felt like he had the upper hand. He turned on his heel and walked out of the office, his heart pounding, but this time not out of fear. He had stood up for himself. He had confronted the system. And it wasn't over yet. Derrick leaned against the elevator wall, the hum of the descent a sharp contrast to the storm raging in his mind. The day had turned into a blur of chaos. Jason's dismissal, the coldness of the office, and the pit of frustration that had slowly been eating away at him for years. It wasn't just a day. It wasn't even just about his firing. It was everything that had come before it. He had always been the hard worker, the one who never took shortcuts, who stayed late to pick up the slack, who gave everything for a company that barely seemed to notice. But the subtle injustices had always been there, lurking just beneath the surface. The looks that didn't quite meet his eyes, the promotions he was passed over for, the emails and meetings where his ideas were ignored, only to be praised when they came from someone else. Someone who wasn't black. Derrick's hand clenched around the strap of his briefcase, the weight of it suddenly heavy as the elevator slowed. His thoughts drifted back to the first time he had noticed it. The first time he had realized that being different in the eyes of those around him meant something entirely different. It had been 3 months into his first job at the company, back when he was bright-eyed and hopeful. He had just finished presenting an idea to the team, a proposal that he had spent weeks crafting. The response had been lukewarm at best. A few murmurs of agreement, a couple of polite questions, but nothing more. Then, a few weeks later, the same proposal, word for word, detail for detail, was presented by Karen, the assistant manager. She was bubbly, blonde, and white. Suddenly, the room erupted with excitement. What a brilliant idea. Karen, this could really change the direction of the project. Derrick had just stood there, watching as his hard work was praised. Not because it was his idea, but because it came from someone who looked like everyone else in the room. It wasn't the first time something like that had happened, and it wouldn't be the last. The elevator door slid open with a soft ding, pulling Derrick from his thoughts. He stepped out and walked through the lobby, his heart a little heavier with every step. He had felt the sting of systemic racism for years, but it had always been so insidious, too subtle to fight, too ingrained to challenge directly. It wasn't just one person. It wasn't just Jason. It was the entire environment, the culture that existed, one that allowed for these moments of exclusion to occur again and again. Derrick could feel the weight of it in the pit of his stomach, the suffocating realization that he had always been playing a game where the rules were stacked against him. The cool air outside was a welcome relief. Derrick walked briskly toward his car, not wanting to linger in a building that had felt like both a cage and a prison. As he reached for the door handle, his phone buzzed. The notification was from a number he didn't recognize. Hesitantly, he answered. "Derrick? It's Linda. From HR." His heart skipped a beat. He had been expecting a call, but not so soon. "Yeah, Linda, what's up?" "I need you to come back to the office. There's something we need to discuss. It's about Jason." Derrick paused, feeling the tension rising again. "What about him?" There was a brief silence before Linda responded. "It's a situation. Just come back. It's urgent." The line went dead before Derrick could say anything more. He stared at his phone, the weight of what Linda might be about to tell him pressing down on his chest. His mind raced, but one thought kept circling. He couldn't just walk away now. He had come too far. If he was going to stand up for himself, to fight back against everything Jason had done, then he couldn't be afraid of what came next. Derrick took a deep breath and got into his car. The engine roared to life, and he drove back to the office, the city blurring past him as his mind worked overtime. Whatever was coming, he had to be ready. Linda was waiting for him in the lobby when he returned. Her face was tight with concern, her hands folded in front of her. As Derrick approached, she quickly ushered him into a conference room. The blinds were drawn, the air inside the room still, almost suffocating. "Sit down, Derrick," she said, motioning to the chair across from her. "I don't know how to put this, but just say it," Derrick said, his voice steady, but the nerves were creeping back into his gut. Linda hesitated, then spoke in a low voice. "Jason's been let go." Derrick blinked, the words not immediately making sense. "What do you mean?" "HR has reviewed everything, Derrick. We've seen things we didn't realize before. I didn't know about some of the things Jason was doing to you. I wish I had, but I didn't." Derrick's eyes narrowed. "Jason's gone." Linda nodded. "Yes, we're taking appropriate action. This isn't just about you. There are a few other cases that, well, this is a bigger issue than we first thought." Derrick didn't know what to feel. Relief? Confusion? Anger? All of those emotions churned inside him. Jason was gone. But why? Was it because of him? Or had it been someone else who had pushed for this? Was this just a reaction to his complaint? Or was it something more? "Linda," Derrick said, his voice low, "what exactly happened here? What's going on?" She looked away, her expression wavering. "I'm not sure of the details, but it's a bigger issue than just you. There's been a pattern here, Derrick. A lot of things are coming to light now, things we missed before." Derrick stood up, the confusion only deepening. "So what? I'm supposed to feel better about this? Jason's gone and I'm still out of job." Linda stood too, her face softening. "No, Derrick, we're going to make sure you're taken care of. We'll work this out." But Derrick wasn't so sure. The anger inside him had found new fuel. Jason's firing was too convenient, too sudden. The pieces didn't fit, and Derrick could feel the seeds of doubt growing. He didn't need their promises. He needed answers, and he would get them no matter what it took. Derrick sat in his apartment that night, staring at the stack of papers in front of him. The world outside his window had turned dark, But inside, the weight of the past few days pressed down on him with a suffocating force. The events of the afternoon replayed in his mind. Jason's sudden departure, the vague promises from HR, the surreal feeling of having the rug yanked out from under him, only to find it replaced with something even more confusing. Jason was gone, but nothing felt resolved. He still didn't have his job back. He still didn't have the respect he deserved. And he still couldn't shake the feeling that this was all part of a game he didn't fully understand. He grabbed the stack of papers and began sorting through them. The email threads, the performance reviews, the timeline of everything that had happened in the last year. He had kept records of everything. Emails where Jason had belittled his ideas, performance reviews that had been either vague or blatantly unfair, moments when Jason had taken credit for his work or dismissed him with a few choice words. These weren't just isolated incidents. They were part of a pattern that had been hidden behind closed doors for far too long. Derrick felt his blood start to boil again. He had been patient. He had kept his head down and done the work, always thinking that things would get better if he just did his job. But now, with Jason gone, it felt like he was finally able to see the truth. The truth wasn't just that Jason was a racist or that he had treated Derrick unfairly. The truth was that this entire system, the company, the office, the structure that had allowed this to go on for so long, was broken. It wasn't just Jason. It was everyone who had turned a blind eye to the countless little injustices that happened every single day. But now, Derrick had a chance to do something about it. He wasn't going to sit by and let this go. No, he had been silent for far too long. And silence, he realized, was part of the problem. The people who suffered in silence were always the ones who paid the price, the ones who were erased from the story. It wasn't enough for Jason to be fired. Derrick wanted something more. He wanted accountability. He wanted the truth to come out. And he knew that the only way to make that happen was to fight back, not just for himself, but for everyone else who had been swept under the rug, ignored, or pushed aside. His phone buzzed. It was a message from Greg, one of his few trusted colleagues. Derrick hadn't heard from him since the firing. "You okay?" Derrick hesitated for a moment before typing his response. "I don't know. Everything's been so messed up. But I'm not just letting this slide. Not this time." He hit send, then leaned back in his chair, letting the weight of his decision settle in. It was going to be a fight. A long, hard one. But he was ready. A few minutes passed, and then Greg responded. "You're not alone in this, man. If you need me, I'm here. Let me know what you're planning. We've got your back." Derrick's lips curled into a small, grateful smile. He hadn't expected much support from his colleagues, but this felt like a lifeline. One person, just one, who was willing to stand with him. That was enough for now. But now, the plan had to take shape. He couldn't just file a complaint with HR and hope for the best. He needed evidence, not just of Jason's behavior, but of the company's complicity. If Jason had been allowed to get away with this for so long, then who else had suffered? And how far did this toxic culture go? Derrick needed to know. He grabbed his phone again and scrolled through his contacts until he found what he was looking for. The number of his lawyer, Claire, he called, his fingers trembling slightly as he held the phone to his ear. Claire picked up on the second ring. "Derrick? What's going on?" "I need your help," Derrick said, his voice firm. "It's time to take action." There was a brief pause, and then Claire spoke, her tone cautious but curious. "What are we talking about?" "Jason's gone. But this is bigger than just him. I've been tracking the things that have happened. The way the company's treated me. The way Jason's treated me. It's systemic, and I need to expose it. I can't do it alone." "I hear you," Claire said, her voice soft but resolute. "Tell me what you've got. Let's make sure this counts." Derrick outlined everything. The emails, the performance reviews, the instances where he had been passed over for opportunities, the ways in which Jason had undermined him. He told Claire about the subtle discrimination he'd endured from his first day, the microaggressions that had cut deep, even though no one had ever said the words directly. It wasn't just about the incidents themselves. It was about the culture they were part of, a culture that allowed men like Jason to continue with impunity. "You've got a case, Derrick," Claire said when he finished. But it's not going to be easy. These things rarely are. And we'll have to build a solid case. It's going to take time. We're going to need more than just your experience. We're going to need the stories of others, too. Derrick took a deep breath. I'll get those stories. You're not alone, Claire said. I'm with you on this. The phone call ended, and Derrick stood up, pacing around his small apartment. This was it. This was the moment when everything changed. He wasn't going to let the system win. Not this time. He sat back down and began organizing the documents in front of him again. But this time, it was different. This time, he was building something. He was building a case for justice. The following days passed in a blur, the kind of blur that comes with knowing you're stepping into unknown territory, but you can't afford to hesitate. Derrick's apartment was littered with papers, notes, and files. Each piece of part of a puzzle he had spent years trying to piece together. He had called Claire, his lawyer, multiple times, and now their conversations had shifted from small talk to planning. He was no longer just angry. He was methodical. He had become an investigator, a strategist, and above all, a man on a mission. He had learned over the years how to be quiet in the face of injustice, how to keep his head down and swallow the bitterness of being overlooked and underappreciated. But now, that silence no longer served him. It only protected the people who had failed him. The fight wasn't just personal anymore. It was about more than just his job. It was about exposing a broken system, a system that had been built on people like him being invisible, pushed aside, and silenced. Derrick was done with that. If he couldn't stand for himself, maybe someone else would finally stand for the others who had been quietly suffering under the same weight. He sat at his kitchen table, the morning light filtering through the blinds, casting thin bars of light across his papers. He had his strategy mapped out. It was simple in theory, but Derrick knew it would be anything but easy. First, he would need evidence, not just his own, but from others. He knew Jason hadn't been the only manager who held biased views. He wasn't the only one who treated employees like pawns to be discarded when it was convenient. Derrick needed to find those voices, those hidden stories. But he also needed a clear path forward, something that would allow him to take down the walls of silence that had protected Jason and others like him. Legal action, yes. Public action, too. But first, he needed to find allies within the company who would help him, who would speak out. And he wasn't going to stop until he had the truth. The first part of the plan was reaching out to people he trusted. His first call had been to Greg, who had offered his support. Greg had been a colleague for years, a quiet but reliable presence who had always treated Derrick like a peer. Derrick hoped he wasn't the only one who had noticed injustices, but Greg had been the first to speak up. That was a good sign. The next step was reaching out to the other employees who had either been affected or had witnessed Jason's behavior. Derrick was aware that many were too afraid to speak out, but he wasn't expecting all of them to be willing to come forward. He just needed a few. Derrick's phone buzzed. It was a text from Greg. Got your back, Derrick. I know a few people who've seen things. I'll reach out. Derrick smiled, despite the heaviness still hanging in the air. Greg had always been a quiet ally, but now he was proving that silence wasn't the way forward. He typed a quick response. Thanks. We need to hit them with everything we've got. The next few days were spent gathering information. Derrick found old email threads, performance reviews that were written in vague terms, and his own records from meetings where Jason had made dismissive comments about him or his work. There were countless emails where Jason would apologize for misunderstanding Derrick's input, only to act as though it never happened. But the most important evidence came from Derrick's colleagues. One by one, people began reaching out to Derrick. Some were employees who had worked with Jason in the past, and others were current colleagues who had witnessed mistreatment or felt the subtle discrimination themselves. Some were afraid to come forward, others eager to expose the truth. The common thread was that they all knew Jason's behavior hadn't been an isolated incident. They knew the system was rigged. Derrick sat down with each of them individually, listening to their stories. Some were small incidents, subtle microaggressions that had cut deeper than anyone realized. Others were outright dismissals, like the time Jason had completely ignored a suggestion from one of Derrick's teammates, only to take credit for it himself later. No one had ever said anything at the time, but everyone had seen it. After each conversation, Derrick felt a mix of anger and validation. Anger that the company had allowed this to happen for so long, and validation that he wasn't alone in this fight. But Derrick also knew this was enough. He needed more than just stories. He needed something tangible. He needed Jason's behavior exposed for what it truly was, racism disguised as corporate decisions. He picked up the phone again and called Claire. "Derrick." Claire answered quickly, her voice warm but professional. "What's going on?" "I've got more people willing to speak up. I've got evidence." "Two. This goes deeper than just me." "Claire, Jason wasn't the only one. I'm putting together everything I can." "Good," Claire said. "But remember, we need it to be airtight. We're going to file a formal complaint, and we're going to make sure this sticks." Derrick sat up straighter. "I want more than just a firing. I want accountability. I want this to be a lesson for everyone who thinks they can get away with this." "Understood," Claire said, her voice unwavering. "We'll hit them where it hurts. But we need to make sure we have everything. It's not just Jason we're going after. This is bigger than him." Derrick nodded, though she couldn't see him. It was true. This wasn't just about Jason anymore. It was about the culture he had built and the silence that had protected him. The deeper Derrick dug, the more he realized how ingrained the system of discrimination was. It wasn't just Jason. It was the company's entire structure, built on a foundation that ignored or erased the voices of those who weren't white, male, and middle class. The next few days blurred into one another, Derrick spending hours drafting legal documents, talking to more colleagues, and collecting every shred of evidence he could find. Claire was busy, too, preparing their legal strategy and making sure everything would hold up in court. But Derrick knew this wasn't just about the law. It was about people who had been silenced for too long. Derrick's resolve hardened with every phone call, every conversation. He wasn't just fighting for his own job anymore. He was fighting for justice, for the people who had been pushed aside and forgotten. This was just the beginning. He glanced at the stack of documents in front of him, his fingers brushing over them. He could already feel the weight of what was to come. The fight was far from over. But for the first time, Derrick felt a real sense of control. He wasn't powerless anymore. He had a plan. And now, it was time to make it happen. Derrick had expected resistance. He'd expected pushback, even threats, as he began to make his case. But nothing had prepared him for the full force of the company's retaliation. He had been working with Claire for weeks now, carefully putting everything in place, gathering witness statements, and preparing his legal complaint. They were moving forward cautiously, step by step. But the moment they submitted his formal complaint to HR, everything changed. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a meeting request from a higher-up. It wasn't unusual for HR to get involved at this stage of things, but the tone of the email was clear. They were giving Derrick one last chance to reconsider his complaint. But that wasn't what rattled him. What unnerved Derrick was the absence of any direct mention of Jason. There was no acknowledgement of the events that had led to his filing. No recognition that Jason's behavior had been part of a larger pattern. The message, instead, was about Derrick, about his attitude, his confrontational nature. It was a typical move: shift the blame, make the accuser problem. It wasn't just Jason's behavior they were trying to cover up. It was the culture, the environment of systemic racism that had allowed it all to happen in the first place. He clicked the email shut and leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. The room felt small, the walls closing in on him. The old fear, the feeling that maybe he was overstepping, that maybe he wasn't the one who should be fighting this battle, crept into his chest. But he swallowed it down. He couldn't let it paralyze him now. There was a knock on his door. He turned to see Greg standing in the doorway, looking as weary as Derrick felt. "You okay?" Greg asked, his voice gentle. Derrick nodded, though it wasn't entirely true. "Just getting the runaround. I filed a complaint, and now they're trying to make it about me, not about what Jason did." Greg walked in and sat across from him, his expression grim. "I saw the emails. The company's already starting to spin it. They're trying to discredit you. Derrick, that's the first move. But we both know what happened." Derrick clenched his fists, feeling the anger rise again. The nerves in his chest pulsed with frustration. Yeah, I know. But what good is it to know the truth if they don't care? If no one listens? We have to make them listen, Greg said, leaning forward. You're not alone in this. There's a lot of us who've seen what Jason did, and we're not going to let them bury it. Derrick felt a small flicker of hope stir inside him, but it was quickly smothered by the weight of everything he had to do. But it's not just Jason, Greg. This is about the whole damn system. It's bigger than one person. I get it, Greg replied, his voice firm. But we start with what we know. We expose Jason, and then we keep pushing. The system doesn't change unless people like us push it to. Derrick stared at his friend for a long moment, the weight of their shared understanding settling between them. Greg was right. Derrick couldn't go after the system all at once. He had to start small, start with the tangible, the undeniable evidence of Jason's actions. And then, when Jason was gone, he could turn the lens on the rest of the company, on everyone who had kept their heads down, who had allowed this to happen. But first, he needed to make sure that Jason's removal from the company was more than just a temporary fix. He needed to expose what had been happening under the surface for far too long. The next day, HR called him in for another meeting. This time, it wasn't just an email. This time, it was a sit-down with the head of HR, the legal team, and an unfamiliar face, a company consultant who had been brought in to mediate the situation. Derrick walked into the conference room with a calm exterior, though inside, his heart pounded like a drum. Derrick, thank you for joining us, the HR director said, the tone of the room formal and stiff. We've reviewed your complaint, and we want to give you an opportunity to clarify your position before we proceed any further. We want to resolve the situation amicably, if possible. Derrick knew this was their attempt at damage control. They were trying to make it seem like they were taking his concerns seriously, but Derrick wasn't fooled. He had been in enough meetings to know when he was being placated. I don't think there's much to clarify, Derrick said, his voice steady, though he felt the tension in his shoulders. Jason's treatment of me was just one part of it. This goes beyond him. The HR director nodded, looking over some documents on the table in front of her. We understand that you've had some difficult experiences, Derrick, but it's important to note that your actions have been disruptive to the team. We received feedback about your attitude and your unwillingness to collaborate. Derrick's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice even. What feedback? I've never received a formal warning. I've never been told I'm anything but a top performer. The consultant, a tall man with a clipboard in hand, cleared his throat. Derrick, you've been labeled as difficult to work with. There are several complaints about your inability to take feedback and your aggressive behavior in meetings. Derrick's blood ran cold. He had known this was coming. They were framing him as a problem, just like they had done to so many before him. But he couldn't back down now. He couldn't let them turn this into his fault. I'm not the one who's been mistreated, Derrick said, his voice hardening. Jason's behavior was the problem, not mine. I've been passed over for promotions, ignored in meetings, and I've had my ideas stolen and credited to others. This isn't just about my attitude. It's about what's been going on for years. And now you're trying to make me the bad guy for speaking up. The HR director's expression faltered, but the consultant spoke up, his tone cold. We need to address this in a professional manner. If you continue to escalate things in this manner, it may affect your ability to work here moving forward. Derrick's hands clenched at his sides, his knuckles white. He wasn't going to back down. Not this time. You want me to stay quiet, he said, his voice a whisper of anger. And I won't do it. I won't let this go. You want me to be the good employee, but being quiet didn't get me anything. You think firing Jason will solve this, but it's just a Band-Aid. The real problem is you. The room went silent. Derrick's words hung in the air like a challenge, and though he could feel the eyes on him, he didn't back down. For the first time, he felt like he had taken control of the situation. They might have been trying to break him, but in that moment, Derrick knew. The battle had only just begun. Derrick didn't expect to feel relief after the meeting. There was no sense of victory, no moment of triumph. Instead, a gnawing, familiar feeling took root in his chest. Unease, like standing on the edge of a cliff and watching the ground below shift with each passing second. The company's response had been expected, but hearing it laid out so plainly, the cold dismissal, the attempt to undermine him, made his stomach turn. It wasn't just about Jason anymore. It wasn't even just about the company. The problem ran deeper. The fight wasn't going to be easy, and Derrick knew it. But now he had no choice. There was no turning back. The system was built to protect people like Jason, people who made decisions in boardrooms while others suffered in silence. But silence, Derrick had learned, only gave the system more power. It wasn't just about making the loudest noise. It was about making the truth undeniable. He spent the next few days digging through records, pulling old emails, revisiting every conversation, every encounter with Jason, everything that he had ever brushed off as minor. No more. The dots were there. He just had to connect them. Derrick sat in his living room, the faint glow of his laptop screen casting a shadow over his face. He was tired, the kind of exhaustion that settled deep in your bones. But he kept going, scouring through emails, performance reviews, and old memos. He had been at this for hours. The weight of the task was pressing on him, but he pushed through it. He had to find something solid, something that would stand up to scrutiny. The last thing he needed was for the company to claim this was just a misunderstanding, or worse, an overreaction. Then he found it. An email, buried in the middle of a long thread, stood out to him. It was a message from Jason to HR dated several months ago. Derrick's pulse quickened as he opened it. At first, it seemed innocuous, another routine report on team performance. But then he read the last few lines. Derrick has been challenging team dynamics and questioning my decisions. He's disruptive, and while he's a strong worker, his attitude is a liability. I recommend we start considering other options for his role here. Derrick's heart pounded in his chest as he reread the words. His mind flashed back to every subtle, dismissive comment Jason had made to him. Every time his ideas were rejected without explanation. Every instance when Jason had ignored his input, blaming him for problems that weren't his fault. This wasn't just about a bad day or a clash of personalities. Jason had been actively working to push him out, to ensure his career was stalled. The company had let it happen. Worse, it seemed like they were complicit. Derrick clicked through to the next email, and there was again a pattern of bias. In every single performance review Jason had written for him, there was a line about attitude or aggression, but never anything specific. It was always vague, always suggestive of a problem that wasn't there. Derrick could see the story being painted, and it wasn't his story. It was one the company had let Jason write, one that everyone had believed. This wasn't just about Jason's personal bias anymore. This was systematic. The company had been enabling his actions, protecting him, and allowing him to perpetuate this false narrative about Derrick. The walls of silence had been built brick by brick, and Derrick had spent years trying to break through them. He leaned back in his chair, the weight of the revelation sinking in. He'd been right. This wasn't just one bad manager. This was the result of a culture that allowed people like Jason to thrive. Derrick wasn't just fighting for his job anymore. He was fighting to expose the company's complicity, to show everyone that it wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had been made to feel like they didn't belong. He sent the emails to Claire, his heart racing. She responded quickly, her words encouraging but cautious. This is good, really good, but we need more. We need the stories of others who've been affected. This is the foundation of your case, Derrick. But it can't just be about you. It's about the culture. Derrick knew she was right. The next step was to gather those stories, to show the company that Jason was an anomaly. He was a symptom of a deeper problem. Over the next week, Derrick's days were consumed with interviews, conversations with former employees, and more evidence gathering. The more people he spoke to, the clearer it became Jason had been the face of a much larger issue. Derrick wasn't the only one who had suffered. There were others, people who had been overlooked, pushed aside, silenced. And many of them, like Derrick, had tried to go through the proper channels, only to find themselves dismissed, ignored, or punished for speaking up. He sat with Maria, a former employee who had worked in the HR department, now long gone from the company. She had been there when Derrick had first started, and her story mirrored his. Maria had been passed over for a promotion, despite being more qualified than the candidates they hired. The excuse had always been that she didn't fit the company culture. But when Derrick asked her for more details, she hesitated, then leaned in closer. "There were whispers," Maria said, lowering her voice as though afraid someone would overhear. "Jason always said you weren't a team player. But you weren't the only one. He'd say the same thing about a lot of us, especially those who weren't like him. I don't know if he ever said it outright, but it was there. You could feel it. If you weren't one of the right kind of people, you didn't get the same chances." Her words hit Derrick like a punch to the gut. He had known, on some level, that Jason's behavior wasn't just personal, but to hear it confirmed from someone else was like pulling the curtain back and seeing the rot that lay beneath. "You're not alone," Maria added softly, her eyes filled with the same anger and regret Derrick felt. "And if you're serious about taking them down, you've got allies." Derrick left that meeting with a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just building a case anymore. He was building a movement. That night, Derrick met with Claire again. This time, he had more than just emails. He had a network of people who were ready to speak out, people who were willing to risk their careers to do the right thing. They were ready to expose the truth. As he sat in her office, Claire's eyes gleamed with a mixture of hope and caution. "You've got the evidence, Derrick. Now we make them listen." Derrick's hand shook slightly as he pushed the stack of papers across her desk. "We'll make them listen. And when they do, we'll show them that this wasn't just about one man. This is about the system that protected him." Claire nodded, picking up the documents. This is only the beginning. And Derrick knew it. But for the first time in years, he wasn't afraid. This time, the system would change. The morning air was sharp as Derrick stepped out of his apartment, a fresh sense of determination flooding his veins. Today wasn't just another day in a long battle for justice. It was a day the truth would finally be seen. For weeks, Derrick had quietly gathered everything. The emails, the performance reviews, the witness statements. He had spoken with former employees who had been pushed out of the company for speaking up, people who had faced the same prejudice he had. But now, it was time to make the world see what had been happening behind the closed doors of that sterile, soulless office building. He had been in close contact with Claire, and they had worked together to make sure everything was legally sound. But now it was about more than just the legal case. It was about public pressure, about exposing the truth to the world. Derrick had given interviews to local news stations, and now, with the media's attention, the corporate machine could no longer pretend it didn't see the issue. The local news station had been the first to run a segment about Derrick's case. But today, he was scheduled for an interview that would air on national television. The stakes were higher than ever. The company couldn't ignore it anymore. They couldn't sweep it under the rug. But Derrick was prepared for this. He had to be. The news studio was bustling with activity, a stark contrast to the nerves tightening in Derrick's chest. As the crew prepared the set, Derrick stood off to the side, looking at the stage from the corner of his eye. His palms were sweaty, but he wiped them on his pants and took a slow, steadying breath. He had made it this far. There was no turning back. Claire stood beside him, offering her quiet support. "You've got this," she said, her voice calm and confident. "Just tell your story. They can't deny the truth." Derrick nodded, trying to gather his composure. He had spent the last few weeks piecing together his experiences, his pain, and his fight for justice. Today, he would make sure that everyone knew. This wasn't just about him. It was about every person who had been pushed aside, whose voice had been silenced. It was about exposing a culture of discrimination that had gone unchecked for far too long. A producer came over, signaling that it was time. Derrick's heart raced, and he could hear the faint hum of the camera equipment in the distance. The weight of what he was about to do settled on him. But it wasn't fear that filled him. It was resolve. The lights brightened and the host, a well-known journalist named Karen Walker, greeted him with a welcoming smile as he sat down across from her. The camera's red light blinked on, and the interview began. "Thank you for joining us today, Derrick," Karen said, her voice warm and welcoming. "I know this isn't easy for you, but we appreciate you being here to share your story." Derrick nodded, taking a deep breath before answering. "Thank you for having me." She leaned forward slightly, her expression serious. Now, Derrick, you've been in the news recently for speaking out about your former employer. Can you start by telling us a little bit about what led you to speak up? Derrick's chest tightened as he spoke, but his words came out steady, unwavering. For years, I worked at this company, doing everything I could to succeed. But the truth is, it was never enough. I watched as colleagues with less experience and fewer qualifications got promoted over me. I watched as my ideas were dismissed, only to be taken by others and praised. And when I tried to speak up, to question why this was happening, I was labeled difficult, aggressive, unfit for the job, all because of my race. Karen's expression softened as she listened, her eyes reflecting a deep empathy. That's incredibly difficult to hear. And now, after everything you've been through, you decided to take legal action and expose the discrimination you experienced. Derrick nodded, his voice growing more intense. Yes, I fought for years to be heard, but the system protected people like Jason. It protected the people who saw me as a threat because I was different. It protected the people who used power to shut me down. But I'm not the only one. I'm here today because there are other people who suffer the same way, who've been treated the same way, and they need to be heard too. The camera shifted slightly, zooming in on Derrick's face as the words sank in. Karen's gaze remained locked on him, the seriousness of his words echoing in the air between them. You mentioned Jason, Karen continued. What do you want people to know about him? Derrick's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice level. Jason was the face of the problem, but he wasn't the only one. He represented a system that saw me as lesser, as someone who didn't belong. He was allowed to get away with it because of the culture that existed at the company. But it wasn't just Jason. It's the entire system that needs to be held accountable. He's just the one who's been exposed. Karen leaned back slightly, processing his words. And now, Derrick, you receive a lot of support both from colleagues and from people outside of the company. How does that make you feel? Derrick paused, his eyes scanning the studio for a brief moment before settling on Karen's. It's overwhelming, honestly. I didn't expect this level of support. I didn't expect so many people to come forward and say, I've been there too. But I'm not doing this just for myself. I'm doing it for everyone who has ever been ignored, dismissed, or hurt. I want to be the person who finally brings this to light. We can't keep pretending it's not happening. The interview continued, but Derrick's words had already begun to reverberate across the country. His story was reaching far beyond the studio walls, reaching people who had never met him but who understood the truth of what he was saying. The media had picked up on his story, and it wasn't just the local stations anymore. It was national news, the story of an employee who had been wronged and fought back. The company, once confident it could weather the storm, was beginning to feel the pressure. People were talking. Social media erupted with support for Derrick, with people sharing their own stories of workplace discrimination, some of them too afraid to speak publicly, but finding strength in Derrick's bravery. And then the backlash came, a statement from the company. We take these allegations seriously and are investigating the matter thoroughly. We are committed to fostering a culture of inclusion and equality. Derrick couldn't help but laugh when he read it. It was the same corporate speak he had heard 1,000 times, empty words meant to deflect attention and keep the public at bay. It wasn't enough anymore. The fight was far from over. The company was scrambling to protect itself, but Derrick had a head start. He had done what no one thought he could do. He had made them listen. As the interview concluded, Karen turned to him with a final question. Derrick, what do you hope comes from all this? Derrick's gaze was unwavering as he spoke. I hope people understand that this isn't just about one person's fight. It's about the people who are too scared to speak up. It's about the people who have been pushed down by a system that doesn't care. I hope this is the beginning of real change. He stood, his heart pounding in his chest, but for the first time in a long time, it wasn't fear he felt. It was hope. The walls were coming down, and Derrick was at the forefront of it. The days following Derrick's public interview felt like a whirlwind. The world was watching now. The company, once untouchable in its corporate tower, was starting to crumble under the pressure of public scrutiny. Derrick had exposed more than just his personal pain. He had brought to light a toxic system that had been hiding in plain sight, and the world had taken notice. But the fight wasn't over yet. Derrick had won a battle, but the war was far from won. The company's initial response had been predictable, a carefully crafted statement about conducting a full investigation and reaffirming its commitment to diversity and inclusion. They were trying to buy time, but time was running out. The media was relentless, picking apart every word of the statement, and the pressure was mounting. Derrick sat in his apartment one evening, the faint glow of the TV casting a soft light in the otherwise dim room. The news was filled with updates about his case, talk of his courage, his determination, and the growing public support for his cause. His story had gone viral, with people across the country sharing their experiences of workplace discrimination and the fear of speaking up. It was surreal. The outpouring of support was overwhelming, but the weight of it also fell heavy on his shoulders. He knew that what came next would be crucial. His legal team, led by Claire, had been working around the clock. The evidence was there: emails, witness statements, performance reviews, everything that could prove the company's complicity in Jason's behavior. But Derrick also knew that bringing this to court would take time, and during that time, the company would fight back with everything they had. A soft knock on the door broke his thoughts. He looked at the clock. It was late, but he got up and opened the door to find Greg standing there, his face serious but a flicker of excitement in his eyes. "Got something for you," Greg said, holding up a folder. Derrick frowned but took the folder and opened it. It was a document from HR, the company's official response to the lawsuit. They were offering a settlement. The letter was neatly typed, carefully worded, and as expected, full of legal jargon. But the message was clear. The company was ready to make it go away. They were offering Derrick a substantial financial settlement in exchange for him dropping the lawsuit and agreeing to a non-disclosure agreement. It was tempting, no doubt, but Derrick had already made his decision. He tossed the letter onto the table, feeling a knot form in his stomach. "They think they can just throw money at me and make it all go away." Greg nodded, his brow furrowed. "It's a classic move. They want to make this quiet. They don't want the world to see what's really been happening." Derrick's hands clenched at his sides. "I won't be bought. This isn't about the money." Greg looked at him carefully. "You're right. This isn't about the money. It's about accountability. About making sure this never happens again." Derrick stared at the letter for a moment longer before shaking his head. "We're going to court. We're not backing down now." Greg nodded in agreement. "I'm with you, man. Every step of the way." The legal battle was exhausting. Derrick was forced to relive the pain, the betrayal, the constant struggle for recognition in a system that never wanted to acknowledge him. The depositions, the hours spent going through emails and paperwork, the endless meetings with his lawyers. It was all-consuming, but Derrick didn't waver. He had the truth on his side. His colleagues, some of whom had been too afraid to speak up before, began to rally behind him. More and more of them agreed to testify, telling their own stories of how they, too, had faced discrimination, how they had seen Jason's behavior and done nothing, too fearful of the repercussions. But now, they were ready to stand with Derrick, to hold the company accountable. The news cycle had not slowed down. If anything, it was gaining momentum. People were paying attention. The company's lawyers were still doing everything they could to discredit Derrick's claims, but they were losing ground. Every new person who came forward, every new piece of evidence Derrick's team uncovered, weakened their defense. It was a month later when the final hearing took place. Derrick stood in the courtroom, his heart pounding as he listened to the arguments being made. On the other side, the company's legal team was working hard to portray Derrick as disgruntled, to make it seem like he was the one with the issue, that his performance had simply been inadequate. But Derrick knew better. The truth was clear. He had worked harder than anyone, had given everything he had to a company that refused to see his worth. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, it was Derrick's turn to speak. He stood before the judge, the room silent except for the sound of his own heartbeat thudding in his ears. "Your Honor," Derrick began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I've spent 5 years working at that company. I've given everything I had, my time, my energy, my passion, and all I ever got in return was dismissal. I was overlooked, not because of my abilities, but because of who I am. I was told time and time again that I wasn't good enough, that my ideas didn't matter, that I was too difficult. And I let it slide. I kept my head down and worked harder. But when Jason's actions crossed a line, I couldn't stay silent anymore. I refused to let anyone else be treated like that. The room was still. Derrick's words hung in the air, raw and real. His voice, quiet but firm, had the power of truth behind it. A week later, the ruling came down. Derrick had won. The judge ruled in his favor, acknowledging that the company had failed in its duty to prevent discrimination and had allowed a toxic culture to fester. Jason was fired, and the company was required to pay a significant settlement, not just to Derrick, but to any employees who could prove they had been similarly mistreated. The company was also required to undergo an overhaul of its policies, to implement real diversity and inclusion programs, and to make public apologies to those who had been wronged. Derrick felt a mixture of relief and sadness as he read the ruling. Justice had been served, but the scars remained. He had won, yes, but it had cost him. The emotional toll of the fight had been immense. The late nights, the stress, the loneliness, it all weighed heavily on him. But the victory was bittersweet. Jason had lost his job, but the price of that victory was etched in Derrick's soul. Months later, Derrick stood outside the courthouse, the bright sun shining down on him, and he couldn't help but feel the weight of everything that had come before. The battle had been long, but in the end, it had been worth it. He wasn't the same man who had walked into that office, unsure of how he would survive. He had fought for something greater than himself, for something that would impact others long after he was gone. He took a deep breath, his shoulders relaxing for the first time in what felt like years. He had done it. The fight for justice wasn't over. But for Derrick, this was the beginning of a new chapter.